Hello everyone. So in this YouTube video, I'm going to provide an overview of the monopoly model and what we've talked about in class so far. The reason why I wanted to go ahead and provide the support for you so early in the game, even though we just started imperfectly competitive output markets, is because a lot of the periods are in different places. So I know first period, there's a lot of kids that were absent yesterday and this morning. Second period and sixth period seem to be going pretty strong with the monopoly model. And seventh period had a fire drill yesterday that interrupted, and so they're a bit behind. So hopefully this is a way to kind of provide support to those that need it. So we discussed a monopoly. We watched that Luxottica 60 Minutes report. Luxottica doesn't quite have a monopoly on sunglasses in the world, but it's pretty close. And we said the monopoly model is a model that is on the other extreme of a perfectly competitive market. And basically studying these extremes allows us to understand the range of possibility that exists between these extremes. So the definition of monopoly is right here. A monopoly is a market with one firm or one business. And we kind of use this language. A monopolist is a price maker. We're going to assume for now one price, but it will eventually get to a situation where we'll have a perfectly price discriminating monopolist and sort of see another extreme. Remember, in perfect competition, you can go watch the previous YouTube video about perfectly competitive output markets, but essentially we assumed that the demand curve for an individual firm in a perfectly competitive output market is perfectly elastic. So we have a horizontal demand curve with the slope of 0. It's also going to be the price, marginal revenue, and the average revenue line. However, in a monopoly market, you own the market, right? You have to wrestle with the entire demand curve. And so in a monopoly market, similar to a perfectly competitive output market, the demand curve is downward sloping. Now remember, this demand curve, this horizontal demand curve, reflects the demand for an individual firm's output, but that doesn't mean that the market demand curve is not downward sloping. The market demand curve, we're assuming in a perfectly competitive output market, is downward sloping. So if you operate within the entire market, you can get what is called, or you own the entire market, you sell to the entire market, you can get the poisoning effect. So there's this misconception that monopolists are all powerful. Yes, they have a lot of power associated with them, but there are still some limiting conditions. Specifically, you have to still protect, or you have to still respect the demand curve. Nobody wants a monopoly on dog poop, but a monopoly on Ray-Ban's luxury sunglasses, pretty cool, or pretty, potential for a lot of profits. But we're assuming for now that if you charge one price, you have what is called the poisoning effect. And we can see this by kind of graphically representing total revenue. So at P1, we can see the associated quantity demanded at P1, and we can remember total revenue is a function of price times quantity, so this is the total revenue represented graphically. But if we wanted to sell more, we would have to lower the price, and we would get, this is the total revenue. And because of this poisoning effect, we should expect a marginal revenue curve that is disjointed from the demand curve. Okay? So now we're going to move on to the monopoly model, and I'll draw it for you again in a moment. And so in the monopoly model, we're going to draw a y-axis, and we're going to draw an x-axis. Label it P, label it Q, downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue curve. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to layer on top of this, in particular, we're going to layer on top of this, sorry, making sure the camera's still working, our cost curves, ETC curve, and the marginal cost curve. Okay, so I did get an interesting question, right? These are really kind of like, graphs are mental shortcuts for us to understand economics, right? And this was kind of brought up in 7th period. The student really wanted to understand, like, sort of so much of the economics that this graph comes with, right? They wanted to understand explanations for why the marginal cost curve is upward sloping, the ATC curve looks like it does, the demand curve, and the marginal revenue curve. And I would just say we have gone over those things, and it is hard because this is your first year taking economics for students to memorize those types of things. And so one way that you can think of graphs is you can think of them as sort of like mental shortcuts for getting at a more intuitive, using it as sort of as like a tool to understand economics, and hopefully pursue economics further down the line. Then you'll start getting better at memorizing sort of the explanations around specific features of graphs like this. But we've worked with short-run cost curves before. We've explained, for instance, and I don't want to belabor this point, and so you can skip over this part if you want, but we've explained, for instance, why the ATC curve is a curve, right? So it might be initially downward sloping because the average fixed cost, which ATC is is average fixed cost percentage of variable costs. Average fixed costs, remember, are getting divided over increasing units of output, so that might lead to a downward sloping ATC curve, but then our variable costs might be upward sloping at some point, right? And so therefore our ATC curve might turn around. Our marginal cost is going to intersect the ATC curve at the minimum point. We discuss why we face increasing marginal costs in the short run because of this phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns and stuff like that. The demand curve is downward sloping. That goes back to Unit 2. That's kind of intuitive. There's a inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded of a good or service. And then the marginal revenue line, which we see here, is falling at a faster rate than the demand curve. This relates a bit to the poisoning effect, and then we'll kind of do a little bit more hefty math analysis to sort of see why the marginal revenue curve, or the marginal revenue line, is falling at twice the rate of the demand curve, meaning that you could multiply the slope of the demand line by 2, and you get the slope of the marginal revenue line. And this only works if the demand curve is a straight line. Demand curve is a straight line. Okay, so skip over that. If not, then let's just use this to sort of, kind of tell a story without all of that extraneous, for now, economics. So this intersection between marginal revenue and marginal costs, you have to memorize this. This is the profit maximizing condition. And so we can go from this intersection all the way down to the x-axis, and this becomes Q star. So Q star is going to be the profit maximizing output level. And then from this, we can go to the demand curve. And from the demand curve, we can go across, and this becomes P star. P star represents the profit maximizing price, right? Because you wouldn't want to charge, some students started going across there, but no, because, you can charge a higher price and still, get the same quantity sold in the market, right? So you charge that higher price right here. And we can see that this markup, this distance between the price and the cost to produce a good, is something that we should expect in imperfectly competitive output markets, and especially monopoly markets, right? So we have it. And we can actually find profits in a very similar way. We go from this intersection all the way down to the ATC curve and across. We can highlight this area right here. This is going to be your profits. So monopoly profits are a pretty impressive deal. Now what's interesting about this, and I'm going to go ahead and erase this right now, is we can use these tools of social surplus, consumer and producer surplus, and deadweight loss to sort of understand something a little bit more deeply about these types of things. So, in particular, or it's sort of like the welfare effects of this thing. So in particular, we're assuming that this monopolist can only charge one price, and then we said that monopolists actually can charge multiple prices, that they can be price discriminating. So our assumption is okay? And so from here, I'm going to go ahead and shade in orange. I jumped the gun a little bit. I'm sorry. Another way that we can also think of the marginal cost curve as essentially a supply curve, right? Because it is, right? We said the reason why our supply curves are upward sloping is because we face increasing marginal costs, okay? And so if we face an increasing marginal cost curve, right, an upward sloping marginal cost curve and demand curve, we can actually think about in a perfectly competitive output market, at this point, at QPC, that would be the point of production in a perfectly competitive output market. This is what we call allocatively efficient. And the definition of allocative efficiency is right here. It's a point where the output level, where price equals marginal cost. Right? So this would be the allocatively efficient price. However, we can see that this isn't going to happen in the monopoly model. Right? This isn't going to happen in the monopoly model. Like QPC is not going to be produced, Q star is going to be produced. And so we can conceptualize the did weight loss associated with this in black, and we can label this did weight loss. We can see the orange is producer surplus, and then the green is going to be consumer surplus, which we can highlight as everything above the price and below the demand curve. And so, same idea, right? Remember we use consumer and producer surplus. If this were a perfectly competitive output market, we could see the consumer surplus would be significantly larger than it is now. Producer surplus may be smaller, we're not too sure yet. But social surplus would be maximized because this triangle, this black triangle here, did weight loss, would actually become a part of social surplus in a perfectly competitive output market. But because it's not, we can see social surplus is not maximized. And so we have consumer surplus, a price that is represented in this green area here, and producer surplus here. So interesting thing is, with this did weight loss, we have what is called a market failure. A market failure is a situation where leaving the market alone, leaving the market alone doesn't actually maximize social surplus. And so this is pretty crazy, right? We can tell a pretty sophisticated story, right? That this monopoly model is not maximizing social surplus, right? Maximizing social surplus would be here at the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the demand curve. It's not maximizing social surplus, that we have a market failure. We also have a markup. We have a gap between price and marginal cost. We're not producing at the allocatively efficient point. The allocatively efficient point or the productively efficient point, which we predict in the long run, where the price will be tangent to that productively efficient point along the ATC curve in perfectly competitive output markets, is also not being produced. That output is not being produced. And so, there's a lot of, effects that we can see just by changing the structure of our market. So this complicates our economic analysis a little bit, but it allows us also to think about different types of firms and industries in the economy. Cool. Okay, so this assumes that the monopolist can only charge one price. What I told you is that a monopolist can actually charge people different prices and can actually engage in price discrimination to capture more of this surplus. Oh, let me define surplus for you again. So producer surplus, remember, is this graphically represented. It's sort of trying to suggest that the producer would have been willing to supply, obviously at different quantities, this good at lower price points, but doesn't have to. Instead, they get this nice little price point. And the consumer would have been willing to buy this good or service. Maybe this is luxury Ray-Ban glasses at higher price points, but instead gets this price. Okay? So they're just measures of social welfare in society. And then from here, we said that if we assume, right, we're not done yet, that a monopolist can engage in price discrimination. I gave you examples of price discrimination in everyday life, stuff like different prices for teenagers, price differentiation in terms of like hardcover versus softcover books, airline tickets like first class versus coach, all that types of stuff. Pretty cool, or pretty interesting. So if the firm actually engages in price discrimination, and we're going to assume for now, because oftentimes in introductory economics we assume extremes so we can understand the range of possibilities that exist between extremes, we can actually create a situation where this firm is charging people different prices based on their willingness to pay. So if it knew the demand curve and it knew people's individual demand curves for this good, they could charge people different prices, and it was legal to do this. They would essentially do this, and this would no longer be a market failure anymore, a situation in which social surplus is not maximized, but it would be a failure in another sense, because we would have a situation where this producer is charging, obviously wants to charge above marginal cost, but is charging people along this demand curve different prices and is maximizing social surplus, but the whole social surplus is producer surplus. So this would be an example of a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. This has huge implications because it also suggests that our measures of social welfare, this idea of social surplus, has limitations as a tool for thinking about the effects of, or as a tool for kind of measuring the welfare implications of markets or government intervention. Okay, we're done.